Herod in the temple. After his return from Parthenia, Tiberius was sent by Augustus northwest to be governor of Gaul. Agrippa, no longer needed in Rome, went east to the governor of Syria, taking Julia with him and their small sons. For now they had two boys, Gaius, who was between 2 and 3, and the baby brother, whose name was Lucius. Upon his arrival in Syria, Agrippa was looking forward to seeing the many beautiful new buildings which had been erected by Herod in Palestine and also in Syria. They were said to rival in number and magnificence those which he and Augustus had been building in Rome. Especially beautiful, visitors said, was the new temple in Jerusalem. Herod had been king of the Jews for 20 years. The outside world, admiring his accomplishments and ability, had begun to speak of him as Herod the Great. But to the Jews, he was Herod the Terrible. Every year, their hatred of him had increased. Hoping to please them, he had built them the new temple, one to be proud of, but they hated him none the less for it. Their old temple, which it replaced, had stood for 500 years. Poor and dilapidated, it was the one which the exiles had built when they returned from Babylon. It had been stormed so many times since that the walls were zigzagged, with wild cracks and in places ready to crumble. But when Herod proposed to tear it down and build a new one on the site, fear and horror possessed the people. They didn't trust him. What if he planned to build some heathen temple on that sacred site? For years, the Jews had been watching Herod erect buildings of which they did not approve. Temples, baths, palaces, racetracks, all in Greek and Roman style. Enter near every city of his kingdom, there were now amphitheaters for games and chariot races and the degrading combats of gladiators. Just outside Jerusalem, Herod had built a theater in honor of Augustus, where indecent plays about the immoral Greek gods and goddesses were staged. These tempted the young Jews who were forbidden to attend. Within Jerusalem itself, there had been a gymnasium where athletes wrestled naked in Greek fashion, shocking and forbidding to the pious Jews. The princes and high priests, or Sadducees, accepted the foreign ways, but not the majority of the nation. They followed the strict teachings of the Pharisees, and they were horrified when Herod proposed to tear down their sacred temple. Augustus himself had advised Herod not to touch it. If the old temple is not destroyed, do not destroy it, he said. If it is, do not rebuild it. But Herod would not be turned aside from the one thing that he hoped might overcome the stubborn hatred of the people. Solomon, the son of David, had built the first temple. It had been magnificent and splendid. Herod was determined to build a temple even larger and more splendid than that old one of Solomon, which had been destroyed. The outer court of his temple would cover the entire hill from one valley to the other. It would be surrounded by colonnades of white marble, roofed with sweet-smelling cedar. It would have walls and ceilings of beaten gold, gates also of the Corinthian bronze. And before the most holy place would hang a curtain, woven in the most beautiful colors of earth, air, sea, and fire. Thus Herod had planned his temple, and in the building of it he had taken utmost care to see that no hated Gentile, as the Jews had feared, was permitted to work on any sacred part of the temple and so pollute it with their unclean hands. Nor were the temple services interrupted. As soon as any section was torn down, it was rebuilt once. And when the inner temple was complete, Herod had furnished 300 oxen to be slaughtered in sacrifice on the day of dedication in 18 BC. That was a great day. In spite of themselves, the Jews were pleased and proud, and on that day felt, as Herod had hoped, some small amount of gratitude. But soon their hatred of him came back like a flood, for foolishly or in an effort to flatter his Roman overlords, Herod had hung a Roman eagle over one of the gates to his holy temple of the Jews. At the sight of the widespread eagle of gold, that symbol of Rome's power over them, a storm of rage rose among the people. A man who could be guilty of such an outrage could be guilty of any crime. No doubt, the rumor was true that he had robbed and plundered the sacred tombs of David and Solomon. Loose tongues rang wild with tales of crimes Herod had or had not committed. Hope also ran high that the time had come for the long-promised Messiah. Surely, now the Messiah would come to save them from the Romans and this hateful king. A year or so ago, the dedication of the temple, Agrippa, now governor of Syria, visited Herod in Jerusalem. The two men, Herod and his Roman guests, were seated one day on the gallery of the Atona. This was a massive gray stone fortress as the northwest corner of the temple area, which had been named for Antony, Herod's first Roman patron. It was both a palace and a barracks for the Roman troops. Although from where he sat, Agrippa could not see the front of the house or temple itself, since it faced it east, he had a good view of the inner courtyard, which he could have had from no other place. If he had descended one or two of the stairways directly below him, he would have found himself in the outer court of the Gentiles, which was separated from the inner court by a wall 60 feet high. At each of the four gates in that massive wall, painted on the stone in bright red letters, were glaring signs warning foreigners in 3 languages, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, not to enter the sacred court under penalty of death. Only Jews might climb the 12 steps and pass through the gates. Directly inside, as Herod pointed out, was the court of the Jewish women. Only men, no women, were allowed to climb the next flight of steps, and pass through the next gate into the court of Israel. That court of the men, as Agrippa saw, was separated by a low balustrade from the innermost court of the priests. As Herod spoke, a sudden loud bleating mingled with his words. Looking down, Agrippa saw directly below them a new flock of sheep, which were being driven in through a gate in the north wall and were about to be admitted to the court of the priests. Just inside that court, Herod explained, were tables of washing and skinning the animals and hooks on which they hang the carcasses. An underground cistern furnished water to wash the livers before examining them for omens, and also to flush away the filth from the entrails and the blood, through which most of the blood was used to fertilize the gardens of the high priest. And the meat, Agrippa added, I suppose the high priests also get all of that vast amount of meat. Herod nodded, all except a fragment which, with the fat and a basin or two of blood, is burned on the altar. Agrippa inquired about the house itself. Only priests, Herod told him, were allowed to enter. Even while it was being built, he himself had never gone inside. But in the first room were the golden lampstand and the altar of incense and 12 loaves of bread. Beyond that, separated by a veil, was the Holy of Holies, which no one but the holy high priest ever entered, and he only on one day of each year, the Day of Atonement. And what was in that place? Agrippa asked, knowing that the Jews made no graven image of their God. Herod merely shook his head and shrugged his shoulder. Then quite suddenly his dark eyes narrowed sharply. His body grew tense, and he pointed with a trembling finger to a crowd below and talking in wild excitement in the temple courtyard. More of their troublemakers from Galilee, he hissed, prattling about the coming days of the Messiah, when they expected to rid themselves of a hated Romans and of me. Herod's face now turned sickly yellow. He whirled about sharply, as if fearing a hidden dagger might stab him in the back. Rising abruptly, he motioned to Agrippa, and with hasty step disappeared into the doorway of the Antonia, out of sight of the temple which he had built, out of sight of those ungrateful people for whom he had built it, and who still hated him.